Let us look at one article which is written by Arvind Subramanian and Shoumitro Chatterjee. You can take this up as one of the Indian economy reading. The main theme is that they are thinking that it is basically the policy consensus is towards inward orientation. We are moving back from the outward orientation towards the inward orientation. So, should India be growing inward or outward? I mean, our growth process should be inward oriented or outward oriented. And they said this, that this policy consensus, which is towards inward orientation, it is basically because of three myths, which is around the growth process. And what are these basic myths? These basic myths are that our domestic market is large and buoyant. And they dispel this myth. We'll see this. They said this, that India's growth is driven by domestic demand, not by exports. So our policy regime should be towards inward oriented growth instead of the outward export oriented growth. And then the another myth was that India's exports prospects are dim. That even if we assume, the myth is that even if we assume that the growth process is export driven, but what about India? India's prospects are going to be dim. So it is better to focus on inward growth, that is inward oriented growth, rather than export oriented or the outward oriented growth. Both Shoumitro Chatterjee and Arvind Subramanian, they tried to challenge these myths. And they give an evidence. So whenever you read an Indian economy article, idea is that you have to go along with the line of thinking of the author, what author is trying to say. And you also have to look for the evidences which he is going to give in order to prove his point. So in the first section of the paper, they are actually examining whether India's growth has been turned inward, or has actually India turned inward. And they gave evidences for that. That why do they think that there is an inward orientation in India's policy regime? So you have to look for those evidences, and we as examiners would want to know that how far you have understood the reading and what evidences you can give to support your answer, right? So the way these authors have given you the evidence to support their viewpoint, you will also have to give evidence in the answer in order to support your viewpoint, whatever the questions. And you will be writing this out like this, that for example, in case if the question says that has India turned inward? So you might write that according to Arvind Subramanian and Shoumitro Chatterjee, they examined this and they gave evidence for the reasoning that yes, India has turned inward, and the reasoning that why exactly this is the case. Why exactly this is the case. So they examined this. And they said this, we are asking two questions. On macroeconomic front, has India seemed to be turning inward? And on the trade front, has India seemed to be turning inwards? So they're asking this question from themselves. And they said this, that if you look at pre-COVID days, then the growth in India has slowed down. And the reasoning of growth in India being slowed down is given as that the domestic demand has weakened. So the question says that if the domestic demand has weakened, What are you doing to increase that domestic demand, to stimulate that domestic demand? So that's a very reasonable argument. That is because growth has been slowed down due to the fall in domestic demand. So you should be increasing the domestic demand. So there has been surge of the policies which can increase the domestic demand. So there has been redistribution of income, agricultural reforms, and increase in public investment. And this thing is this kind of scenario, that is you have to boost up the domestic market for growth. This is coming, that economic logic is coming from Rosenstein-Rodin model of development. So in nutshell, the model was actually trying to say that you have an underdeveloped country, and for that underdeveloped country to actually go on the path of development, it would require a huge amount of investments. So you try to give investments just little bit, very small amount of investments, that is not going to work. So you need big push of investment so that the economies of scale could be achieved, and these economies, these underdeveloped economies, can actually pull out from the low level of equilibrium trap. Right. Then the question which is arising is, so one question they have answered, that on macroeconomic front, yes, if you look at the policy, we have been trying to improve or increase the domestic demand by various policies. And so they are all driven by increasing the inward orientation. Secondly, they said this, that how on trade policy front India is doing. So if you look at the trade policy front, that is India turning inward? They said that yes. And they gave three arguments for this. The first argument they gave was that there has been increase in tariffs. The second argument they gave was that there is no important FTA has been signed after 2014. So FTA is basically a free trade agreement. So these free trade agreements have been put on hold. And the third argument they gave was that the production subsidies are being given. So if you give production subsidies, it is also acting like a trade barrier. Now let's examine all of these arguments. So the first argument, they said these tariffs have increased. Yes, you look at the situation before 2014. So they said this, that from 1991 to 2014, average tariffs they have reduced from around 125% to 13%, right? So this was the case. So if you reduce the tariff barrier, if you reduce tariffs, so this is going to be beneficial for the economy to open up, economy to be liberalized, economy to be globalized. But if you increase the tariffs, then this is going to act like a barrier, and it is going to close up the economy, in the sense that economy is going to grow inward then instead of outward. Then they said this, if after 2014, what has happened is that the average tariff rate has increased. Average tariff rate has increased from around 13% to nearly 18%. They went on to say that since 2014, what has happened is that if you look at the sectoral tariffs, then what is it that you will find is that as far as agriculture is concerned, in 2014, the tariffs in agriculture, they were sitting at around 35%. So there has been a modest increase in the agricultural tariffs by 3.3%. Then they said this, that there has been an increase in the low skill and the high skill manufacturing also tariffs. for the low skill and the high skill manufacturing. So low skill manufacturing, they have defined like, for example, apparels, textiles, leather, footwear. So there's a low skill. You don't need much skill to develop them. And there, the tariffs have increased a lot. So in 2014, they were sitting at around 10%. And there has been an increase by around, tariffs have increased by around 15%, 15 percentage points. In the high skill manufacturing also, the increase in tariffs has been around by 3.6% for electronic products and 20 percentage points for the assembly of the cell phone products. So they have given an evidence here that the tariffs have increased. So when tariffs have increased, what do you think has happened? Your country has gone away from opening up. You have created a barrier between your country and the trade from the other country. Fair enough. Then they say that the second point they say is that FTA has been put on hold. FTA is like a pact between two countries that the two or more nations, they are going to reduce the trade barriers between them. So trade of goods and services can flow very easily between these two countries. Then Arvind Subramanian and Shoumitro Chatterjee says that India has not signed any significant FTA or free trade agreement after 2014. So this is also, I mean, according to them, this is also a step towards inward orientation. Then they also gave an evidence that why on the trade front, yes, policy seems to be going inward. They said this, that production subsidies have increased. So if, for example, my country is there and subsidies are being given, then these subsidies are going to make the goods cheaper to produce in my own country relative to the foreign country. That is the reason subsidies are given. So if my country is giving subsidies to my producers, my consumers can actually buy these goods from my producers only instead of buying it from abroad. So relatively, my goods have become cheaper as compared to the foreign goods, right? So it means this is going to reduce the imports. This is going to reduce the imports. So there is a trade barrier which has been created. So they said this, that production subsidies have been given on various sectors, for example, electronics, pharmaceuticals, and for other sectors also, production-linked incentives or production subsidies, they are also expected. So this is the answer to the question that has India gone inward? Has India returned inward? So there they gave these evidences. So on macroeconomic front, they said that yes, policy is towards inward orientation. On trade front also, they said that yes, policy is towards inward orientation. Right. Then you have. Then they start debunking the myths. What myths people have about our country and its growth process. One of the first myth is that growth can be based on the domestic market only because it is very big. So look at India's market, they say. And the myth is that India's market is very big. India's domestic market is so big that growth can be based only on the domestic market. We do not need any foreign markets. Something like that, right? So that is okay. They said this, okay, fine. This is a myth. But on what basis this myth is being based? What is the base? What are the bases of this myth? So they said this, that we feel that there is a large domestic market, and this large domestic market can actually work in the favor of import substitution. right? So it increases the scope of import substitution, because when there is already a large domestic market in India, then the firms would be setting up their production units in India instead of setting up abroad, right? Um, or instead of the supply from abroad. So there is large domestic market is increasing the scope for import substitution. This is one basis on which this myth is based. Second is that India can be a large export base. Second is that India can be a large export base. So why, on what basis they are saying this? There is a large population. Large population would mean that there is a large labor force which can be used to produce goods and services, right? So India can be a large export base. Fair enough. I mean, India could be used as a global export base because we already have the large labor force with us. And this labor force can be used to produce goods and services for the world. Fair enough. And if this is going to be the case, then factories and the production units will be set up in my country. They will be giving incomes to my country. My country's income is going to go up. Growth is going to be there. So we have to just focus on our country. This is what this myth is saying. Then there is another basis for this myth. They said this, that India can actually create national champions in the new technology, in the technology intensive sector also. So these are several bases on which this particular myth is based. So this is fine. Fair enough, just relax. On what basis are you saying all of this? Just because you think that your market is big, so your consumption is going to be big. That is the only thing which you are thinking. Okay. This is this, that you look at the population sizes. These population sizes can obscure the market realities. They do not tell the market realities in a complete picture. They don't. So they have given you, they have given the view that Indian market is actually smaller than what is believed it to be. It is not that big, according to them. According to them, India's market is smaller than what is commonly believed to be. So in case if the market is going to be smaller, then the consumption is also going to be smaller. So they are now debunking the myth. They are now dispelling the myths. They say this, India's market is even smaller than China. And not only smaller than China, it is a very, very small fraction of the global market. So let's not get into this, that India's market is very big, so our consumption is going to be big. We do not have to look for the export markets. We do not have to look for the trade with the other countries. Just our own country is going to be enough. It's not going to be the case like that. No. Right. And the problem is that, yes, India has a huge population. But of that huge population, there is a relatively large population of people who are poor. And they do not consume much of the middle class goods, you know. So where the consumption is coming from. So the thing which we say that, oh, there is a lot of consumption in our country, they're not even buying goods. So what is the use for this huge population then? And those who can buy, those who have large amount of incomes with them, those who are high earners, they save a lot. So consumption is again not big, right? So they said, please don't be puffed up just because of this, that your market is big. Your market is not that big, right? They said that you will be comparing yourself with someone who is comparable. Huh? So if you look at your economy today, and if you look at Chinese economy at the level at which you are today, then ask yourself what China was doing at the level at which you are today at that time when it was growing. At that time when it was growing. So they have given an evidence that Chinese economy was sitting at the point at which Indian economy is sitting today in early 2000s. And China has joined WTO and it believed that that there is a potential in the global market, and the real opportunities they lay overseas. They tried to increase the exports a lot, and because of that, China has grown a lot. So this is the way they have tried to dispel the first myth. That is the first myth. Second myth comes from that India's growth has not been driven by exports, it is mainly driven by domestic demand. This is what the thing is. So they said, no, you can't say this. India's exports have been a very important part of India's growth story. You can't just put them away like this, that exports were not important. They've given you very good evidences for this. And since 1991, exports of services and manufacturing have actually increased a lot in India, which has helped in India's growth prospects. They said this, if you look at the export growth of two things, you look at the export growth of goods and services, and you look at export growth of manufactured goods. For what period? For the period of 1995 to 2018. You just look at top three countries. Export of growth of goods and services for the same period, 1995 to 2018. Vietnam was growing at 15.7%. China was growing at 15.5%. And India is growing almost there, 13.4%. It is way above than the world average. And you say that exports have not are not playing much important role in India's growth story. No. Then export of manufactured goods, export growth of manufactured goods. If you just look at that, then also India is sitting at third rank in the export growth. And the growth rate of India in the export growth of manufactured goods is 12.1%, which is almost double of world average. And you say that India's growth has not been driven by exports, and certainly not by manufactured exports. So they've given you the evidence. No, it is not like that. Then they have given an evidence that why they think that exports have been the crucial component of the exogenous demand. Contribution of growth of exports. So your y is equal to c plus I plus g plus nx. So they said that this nx part, the growth in nx part, the contribution of growth due to this growth in nx part, net exports, is almost 1/3 of the exogenous components. Almost. So in the period after liberalization, 1992 to 2001, it was 25%. The contribution to growth of exports, right? The contribution to growth of exogenous demand components. And in that, I have just written for the contribution to growth of exports. Within the exogenous demand components, I've just written here the portion for exports, right? From 2002 to 2011, it was 32%, almost 1 by 3. 2012 to 18, 34%. All of them are giving you what evidence? They are giving you this evidence that exports are the major part of India's growth story. And not only that, Chatterjee and Subramanian, what they say is that after 2012, world exports, they were virtually flat. There was not much growth. But even then, India's growth, India's exports, they actually grew by 3%. And you say that India's growth has not been driven by exports. So this is the way they try to dispel the second myth. So what is it that we have done till now in this reading? We have talked about what Arvind Subramanian and Shoumitro Chatterjee has thought about India turning inward. They asked themselves this question, has India turned inward? And they gave evidences for that. We discussed this. We discussed there are 3 myths, out of which we have already discussed 2 different myths about the Indian growth process in today's recording. We'll be discussing the last myth and how the authors have dispelled that myth also. And not only that, we will be also evaluating the twin prescriptions which are given by policymakers which think that inward orientation is good enough according to authors. So there are 2 prescriptions which policymakers who favor inward orientation, they give. One, that domestic demand should be preferred over exports. And secondly, that protectionism is favored over free trade. We'll be evaluating what are authors' perspective on these 2 prescriptions. And then we will also be discussing the conclusion which Subramanian and Chatterjee gave for this study. So thank you very much. I hope you like this video. Thank you, Beta.